As Confucius said, in the dance of encryption, the weakest link wears a human mask. So what he means by that is that despite all of the failings of WPA2 cryptographically, all of the weaknesses of the protocol, all of the firmware bugs and implementation, most of the problems with Wi-Fi security are on you. Poor password selection, too much password sharing, all of the human factors that go into managing a Wi-Fi network. Of course, Confucius has been dead for thousands of years, so ChatGPT actually said that, but it's still wise words to live by today. So in this video, I'm going to make a tier list from the bottom to the top of the different methods of Wi-Fi security, what the Wi-Fi password means for you, and how you can use it to improve the security of your own network. Come along on this adventure. So all the way down to the bottom, we have open, no security. If you've ever connected to a network with a captive portal where it makes you log in or accept the terms and conditions or whatever, it's probably using open with no security. Just as the name implies, this network is free for anyone to join. We have no authentication of either the user or the network. We have no encryption of our traffic. Everything's in the clear. In fact, I've got a capture going now of an open network with my phone connected to it. You can see all my DNS queries, all my HTTP traffic. It's all in the clear. I mean, using TLS for websites helps secure that traffic, but this is nothing. There is nothing preventing someone from sniffing all of my data on the wire. While we're down here at F tier, WEP belongs here too. Nobody's used WEP in the last 15 years because it's had really horrible security vulnerabilities, but if you're still using it, you probably should stop. It was pretty easy to crack in 2008, and it doesn't get any harder with time. So moving up a bit to E tier, there's a new standard called WPA3 OWE. Stands for Opportunistic Wireless Encryption. And if both your network and your client support OWE, it's a method to have an open network with no authentication, but still have encryption. So essentially how this works is the two devices connect to each other securely, but assume the password is blank. So this means you go through a secure key exchange with WPA3 SAE, you generate your session keys, all your traffic is encrypted, management frames are protected, all of that good stuff. But at no point do you actually authenticate each other. So if you're a hotspot operator or running a guest network or something like that, OWE is sort of like the minimum standard you should be running. Now, of course, not every device supports it. They have to support WPA3, more on that later. But this is the direction we basically should be going. Open networks should be dying. So before I go on to the next couple tiers of algorithms here, all of them share one big problem in common. They use passwords. Passwords are a bit of a touchy subject nowadays. Over the past couple decades, we've relied very heavily on passwords to protect critical infrastructure and computing. However, passwords have a very backwards incentive program. We're asking a human to come up with something seemingly random that's very hard for a computer to guess, and at the same time is easy enough for that human to remember it. Now, I'm not sure if you know this about humans, but they're not great at remembering things. They're really bad at generating things randomly. And computers, what are they really good at? Math, guessing passwords. So there's a very good chance that due to no fault of your own, your password is not very good, and that's going to feed into the security of all of these algorithms coming up. In addition, a lot of these algorithms rely on a symmetric password, so both the network and the client need to know the same password. And that means that for all of the clients to know the same password, only one of them has to slip up and leak it somewhere. Maybe it's your phone automatically sharing your password with a friend, and your friend automatically sharing your password with their friend. Pretty soon the whole neighborhood has your Wi-Fi password. Or maybe it's that new IoT gadget you bought that seemed too cheap to be true on Amazon. You have to tell the app your Wi-Fi password so it can configure it. That app sends your password off to China. Maybe it stores it for you so you can easily set up more of their devices in the future. Whatever. Now your password's all over the internet on some password list like the one I have later in the video. So these are just the hint of some of the reasons that passwords are not good and that we should be transitioning off of passwords to more secure features. And that applies to more than just Wi-Fi too. But let's continue with our tier list and see where this takes us. Next up, in the D tier, we have what most of you guys are probably using on your network, WPA2 PSK, or pre-shared key. As the name implies, this network uses a pre-shared password. Everyone involved in the network has to know the same password, both the network side, the access points, and the client side. And if you're in possession of this password, you can basically do whatever you want. Now, since that password is our only source of authentication, as the network, we accept all clients that know the password, which could be a lot more people than we wanted. But also on the flip side, the clients will accept any network that also knows the password. So it's not that hard for an attacker that knows your password to stand up a Wi-Fi network impersonating yours. Now also down there in E tier is a method called private pre-shared keys or multiple pre-shared keys without radius. So without radius, this is essentially where you go in your Wi-Fi controller and you set up a list of passwords and what VLAN or network this should correspond to. Depending on what password the user typed in, they get binned on a different network. Now, big name wireless setups have had this for a decade now. Unify just implemented it in 2023. They're a bit late to the party though, because this only works with WPA2. Remember how I said it's possible to offline brute force WPA2 with a graphics card? They're essentially using that same method, except they know what all the passwords could be. So they only have to try a couple of them to figure out which one the user typed. Since WPA3 fixed that security vulnerability, this method is not going to work in the future, so you should probably start migrating away from it if you're relying on this method without radius. Now there's another type of private pre-shared key that involves a radius server. This method is a bit different. I've actually made a video on it, link up here for that one. So when a client connects to an access point, one of the things it includes is its MAC address. This is required for radio communications because the MAC addresses are used as the destination for wireless frames. So the access point can take that MAC address, send it off to a radius server, and ask what password that MAC address should be using. The radius server responds with either a yes or a no, and if it responds with a yes, it also includes the password that that client should use to connect to the network. So with this method, there's no cracking WPA2 going on the access point. So this works for both WPA2 and WPA3. And also, because we've introduced multiple passwords for multiple clients, it makes it a little bit more tricky to decrypt frames in the future if you don't know what all of the passwords are that all the clients are using. That doesn't mean it's secure, but it's more secure than just plain WPA2. And this method also works with WPA3. So WPA2, private pre-shared key with radius, I'm putting in C tier. With WPA3, B tier. So it probably sounds like I'm beating up on WPA2 here, but it really kind of deserves it. It was published in 2004 and has been required for Wi-Fi certification since 2006. So it's been around a long time, and we've learned a lot about cryptography in the process. Let's brought you guys in closer so you can watch the master at work here. So WPA2 has been around since 2004, and it has encountered quite a number of cryptographic vulnerabilities over the years. Most of these aren't groundbreaking, but they're all things you should be aware of. First on this list is TKIP. So long ago, they created this dumpster fire called WEP. That was the first form of Wi-Fi security. The security was pretty terrible, and it was broken not that long after. So engineers were scrambling to find a solution for this, and their solution was WPA, the first WPA that we no longer use. And one of the requirements of this was they really wanted to use the same encryption hardware they already had deployed for WEP, and that used the RC4 cipher. So they created a new key scheme called TKIP. That name might sound familiar if you've configured your Wi-Fi network recently. But TKIP uses a new key algorithm for the RC4 cipher used by WEP. And like WEP, it is vulnerable to RC4 attacks. It's a lot better than WEP because it does a better key exchange process, but it's not the best, and you shouldn't be using TKIP on modern devices. A lot of access points still enable TKIP and CCMP, or AES, but you should disable TKIP. Devices have had more than 10 years to adapt. It's been deprecated since 2012. The alternative is called CCMP, which is used by WPA2, and that's based on the AES cipher. AES is a strong modern cryptographic cipher used for symmetric encryption. We want to be using AES, not RC4. Up next on the WPA2 problems list, there's no forward secrecy. So if I sit out in an NSA surveillance van in front of your house and capture your Wi-Fi traffic for months, I can go back in those traffic logs I've captured and decrypt them if I find out what the password is in the future. So I've got a data log here that came from a client, a modern client, connecting to a WPA2 protected network using AES. And I have figured out the password. So if I look here in Wireshark, I see a bunch of data frames that are just data. So they're pretty big here. Their length is over 1,000 bytes, but all I can see is they have data, and that data is just kind of garbage because it's encrypted. But I go here to Preferences, Protocols, and I look for IEEE 802.11, and I can add my password. So it's a WPA password, and the password is Bill Y the Science Phi. And wow, look at that. That traffic is UDP, that traffic is TLS. Suddenly, I have decrypted this Wi-Fi packet that I took yesterday. So maybe it took me a day to figure out what your key was, but I can still go back and figure out what that traffic was yesterday while I was busy decrypting your key. So now we can take a look and filter on just this client traffic. So that's a server hello. So let's filter on that. And let's see, so we're doing UDP to port 443, so that's probably some Quick. Quick is HTTP3, magical protocol. So when you establish a TLS session, the first packet the client sends is the client hello. One of those fields in that packet is the server name identifier. So this is the site we're trying to connect to. So it's connecting to 142.250.190.110. If I go into the TLS packet, and I go into the handshake, so client hello, and I go down in there to the server name extension, I can find it is going to calendar.google.com. Now I can't see the traffic that went there because the TLS session protects that. But I can see the SNI, which is what's on the wire. So clearly someone here was browsing the web. Maybe they were going to Google Calendar, maybe that's just their phone doing some automatic update in the background. But this traffic was taken yesterday. I figured out the key today, I decrypted it. Now the next WPA2 vulnerability is a little bit hard to explain. But essentially, there are certain frames that are transmitted on the network that make it possible for an attacker to capture that frame and then try to decrypt that frame using a password. And if they decrypt it correctly, they can validate that their guess was correct using message integrity checks as part of the message. So the two ways they can do this are by capturing the four-way handshake. So that's the client method. And the other way is to capture a PMKID, which is a newer type of attack. That one requires you to wait about 10 minutes for the access point to send them out periodically. But if you can handle waiting 10 minutes while capturing, you can probably get a PMKID and you can probably decrypt the Wi-Fi password. The other option is to wait for a client to connect. I took that approach because it only takes a couple seconds. So I did my capture on this little PC here. This is a Ryzen embedded system with a Wi-Fi 6E card. This little PC is not going to do any decryption, but I can carry it around with me and capture traffic. Then I can take my traffic home and decrypt it on my gaming desktop. So I don't have the most high-end gaming rig here. It's an AMD RX 5700 XT. But it's capable of about 500 kilohash per second cracking WPA2. And to give some context to that, if you were to use a 8-digit numeric password, and I have no idea what it is, other than that it's all numbers, I could guess that in about a minute and a half. So here I'm going to use Hashcat. I already did the capture, so I have the capture of my network and I have a client connecting to it. And we're going to guess 8 digits. So this is purely a brute force guess. We're going to try every combination of 8 digits. Let's go. So this is not a terribly unreasonable scenario if you're to get yourself in. A lot of hardware comes with relatively insecure default passwords, and a lot of them will have things like 8 or 10-digit numeric passwords. So we see how far we're going here. It says it's going to take 3 minutes and 28 seconds. It's giving me some tips on how to make it faster too. But there we go, 15 seconds in, so 3 minutes and 20 seconds is how long it's going to take. And just again, this is not a super high-end gaming desktop. This is a previous gen AMD graphics card. If you had the latest from NVIDIA, you'd be getting twice the hash rate that I'm getting if you want to pay for a 4090. Oh wow, look at that, figured it out. So it took it 1 minute 21 seconds. It says the SSID is Bill Y the Science Phi, so it knew that because that's broadcast in the clear. And the password is 867530991. Who would use a phone number as their Wi-Fi password? You? Maybe? Maybe don't do that. 1 minute 21 seconds. So wow, yeah, that number password, that was not that secure. For every digit you add, it gets 10 times as long. So if you were to go to a 9-digit password, it would take me about 15 minutes. So for numeric passwords, they're not all that hard to guess because it only goes up by a factor of 10 for each digit. If we have to consider every letter and character, that goes up by a factor of like 80 for each digit. So if your password is all numbers and the attacker knows your password is all numbers, it makes it a lot easier for them to crack. But what if we use a common word or phrase, as humans love to do? Our favorite season, our favorite dog, something like that, our favorite animal. Well, just so happens that people on the internet happen to know what a lot of people's favorite dog and favorite season is, and there's a word list for that. So let's see how long it takes us to decipher the password that I actually used to use on my work computer for some time before they made me rotate it. Password rotation is another story of bad security, but let's try this out. So there goes Hashcat. So I used a password that I have previously used on my computer, and I'm human, so there's a good chance someone else has guessed that before. So there's this nice GitHub repository with lists of common passwords of different types. And they have one list here that is the top 4,800 WPA passwords. These are passwords actual people have used on their network. And if you happen to be a big fan of football or sunshine or the internet, that's probably not the best thing to put in your password, you know. So anyway, I took this list and I downloaded it, but that's only 4,800 passwords. That's not enough. So we need to add some rules to this to spice things up a bit. So Hashcat lets us add rules, and so I added 3 rules in series, and essentially that means it takes the base list and it permutates it 3 times across each of these rules, and it goes through every permutation of each rule on each entry. So we have the number of items in the list, 4,800, times the number of rules in the first file, times the number of rules in the second file, times the number of rules in the third file. Those are all the possible guesses, and we try all of them. This takes about 10 minutes. So I, like many other experts, thought about how people actually use passwords. If you were told, come up with a random word that's secure, you're probably thinking, well, I need a lowercase letter, an uppercase letter, and a number, maybe a symbol. So what if I just take my word list and we make it uppercase, we make it lowercase, we capitalize the first letter, we add some random letters on the beginning that are common, E, H, and T, and L. These are common things people do to mutate their password a little bit to make it seem more secure. And if you just capitalize the first letter, it just means I have to guess twice as many times. It's not that bad. The next thing people do is they modify their word that they picked a little bit. So you could leetify it, make it leet speak. So change out your O's for zeros, change out your I's for ones, change out your 3's for E's, those kinds of things. You can kind of pluralize it, so that's what this does. Turns into an an E, common modifications to words to strengthen them. And for Hashcat, that's not really a big deal. We just have this word list, does its thing. The third thing people do to their passwords is they add a number on the end. So why don't we just try all combinations of numbers? What if we just try all combinations of 2-digit numbers? But what about longer numbers? Well, people tend to use their year, like a birthday, right? Maybe it's the current year, maybe it's the year something special happened. So what if I just try every year from 1940 to 2040? It's not that bad. And so that's what I did. Using the initial word list plus these 3 rule sets, I ran it against my test set. It took about 10 minutes, and it found my password. So Hashcat got us our password. Summer 18, capital S and an 18 on the end. So who could have guessed I would have added a number on the end? Well, a lot of people are forced to rotate their password every couple months for security reasons. In reality, when most people are forced to come up with something new they have to remember, they're just going to stick a number on the end. And if your security is actually good, you're not logging what the passwords are, you're hashing them. So the computer doesn't have a way of knowing you just added a number on the end, you keep changing it every time because it doesn't remember your previous password, it's just their hash. And so this is another big problem with passwords outside of Wi-Fi, is that people keep throwing numbers on the end because they're forced to change them all the time. So we end up with less secure passwords than if someone were to come up with a good one and stick with it. But this is a common example of how people come up with passwords, how I used my knowledge of how people come up with passwords to greatly reduce my search space for randomly guessing passwords, and through that I was able to guess the password in under 10 minutes. Now the last thing that happens is when I do the capture, it prints out a word list for me. The word list are all of the strings that the Wi-Fi monitor finds flying over the air. Most of these are SSIDs. I can take that and add that to my word list and see it get mutated. So for example, if my network name is Bill Y the Science Fi, maybe that's my password too. Is that also your password? Maybe with lowercase, maybe you capitalize the first letter of every word. Why don't we put that through a mutation, see if we can guess different permutations of the network name itself. We can try a lot of them because we have a very short list of network names, probably just one. So that's the third approach I tried. And with that approach, it turns out that on my third test network, the Wi-Fi name just was the password in lowercase. You can guess that in a couple seconds. So don't do that for your password either. It's not just routers too, but also ISPs. Spectrum, for example, makes a habit of making their default Wi-Fi passwords an adjective plus a noun plus 3 numbers. Someone on the internet here has taken the time to combine their adjective list and their word list into a single word list of all of the passwords of Spectrum routers. Just have to add 3 numbers on the end, which Hashcat can do. At the hash rate I'm running on my GPU, if you have a Spectrum default password, 6.5 hours, average of about 3. Not looking great for you, right? If you're looking for an actually good way to generate passwords, Randall Monroe of XKCD has this brilliant technique he published in a comic probably close to a decade ago. So here's his website. You should definitely check him out. He's a great artist. But his thought is essentially that instead of doing something like this, which is exactly what you're going to do, you're going to take a word, you're going to add some stuff on the end, and you're going to do all these common substitutions. And it's going to be hard for you to remember. You should take 4 random common words and just string them together. Make a nice long password. So thanks to his work, there are websites on the internet that will generate these passwords. So this guy has a database of about 7,700 words. It's totally in browser, so it doesn't save the passwords back end. We can keep clicking it until we're happy with what we got over and over. And so with 7,700 words, each time we add a word, it makes it 7,700 times harder to guess. That doesn't even include if we do things like capitalizing the first letter of every word. I like to capitalize the first letter of every word just because it makes it easier to tell where the words are when I'm trying to read it so I can memorize it. So for example, if we have 7,700 words and we're going to raise that to the power of 4 because there's 4 of them, that's how many guesses we'd have to try to get this password. I can do 500 kilohash a second, so we're going to divide by 500,000. So I can guess, this is how many seconds it would take me. That's how many minutes it would take me. That's how many hours it would take me. That's how many days it would take me. That's how many years it would take me. So it could take me up to 222 years, which means on average, I would probably guess the password in 111 years. That's quite a long time. Now that is with my one lonely graphics card at 500 kilohash. I could buy a new RTX 4090 and get like a lot more kilohash. Or I could go to Linode here. Linode has systems that have 4 GPUs, each of which is a RTX 6000. So we'll say conservatively that 4 RTX 6000s is at least 10 times as fast as my computer. So that 222 years becomes 22 years. So only 11 years on average, which is not great, but I mean, we spend a lot on computing at that point. So realistically, in 2024, given the known vulnerabilities of WPA2, if you generate a good secure password, not something short using a common word, a single common word, common substitutions, but an actually good password like I showed you here, you are pretty secure against WPA2 attacks. You are not going to have someone brute force cracking your Wi-Fi password. Maybe if the NSA wants it, they'd be able to do it. Oh, they'd definitely be able to do it. But the chance of you having someone like that after your network is pretty low. And if they're actually after your network, you're going to have to go WPA3 for sure. So coming back to the tier list for a second, if anything is going to make these top tiers, it needs to have better security than WPA2. If only we could come up with some algorithm of exchanging secure session keys over an insecure channel in such a way that we have forward secrecy and we're not vulnerable to offline cracking attacks. In fact, the cryptographic community has already figured that out. They call it the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and it was first published in 1976. So I don't know what the IEEE was thinking in 2004 with WPA2, but they were a couple decades behind. In fact, it's believed that British signals intelligence actually developed the technique in the 60s and didn't tell anyone. So Diffie and Hellman got the credit, but they were still about 10 years behind. So essentially what this relies on is public key cryptography. So each side of the connection has a public key and a private key. We exchange our public keys with each other over the insecure channel. We also generate some random numbers and share those with each other. Then we can both come up with a session key using the information available to us. So it's impossible for an attacker that doesn't have access to one of our private keys to listen in on our session. And if we randomly generate these public and private keys each time we do a session, then it's impossible for the attacker to ever listen if we just throw the key away when we're done. So that is the basis of the newest form of WPA encryption, called the Dragonfly Key Exchange. It's standardized as WPA3 SAE, Simultaneous Authentication of Equals. Now the of equals part comes because it was originally designed for mesh nodes to authenticate to each other, but now it's used for everyone. So essentially this works by doing the Diffie-Hellman key exchange. We use the password of the network as a salt in the process. So the security of the password is no longer important. We can't guess the password because that would involve doing a Diffie-Hellman key exchange, and the network's not going to let us guess 500,000 times a second. It's probably going to kick us off if we try to guess more than about 50 times in a row. The same method is also the one used by OWE that I mentioned earlier, also called Enhanced Open. They just don't have a password to salt. They still do the public-private key exchange, and it's still very secure for clients. There's just no authentication. So the downside to this is we're still reliant on passwords. Apps and friends can still share our password with other people, but now we've fixed all the crypto holes in WPA2. So for that reason, WPA3 SAE goes on the B tier. Now, some people are going to say, well, not all my devices support WPA3, and that kind of really sucks. WPA3 was published in 2018, and it's been required for Wi-Fi certification since 2020, and it's been required for all devices that support Wi-Fi 6, and it's the only security allowed in Wi-Fi 6E on the 6 GHz band. So if you're using any 6 GHz devices, they already have to support WPA3. There's no other option. If you're using anything that supports Wi-Fi 6, it has to support WPA3. And if your device hasn't had a firmware update in the last 5 years to add WPA3 support, do you really want to be using that device? So nevertheless, some wireless systems, including UniFi, will warn you about compatibility with WPA3. But if you want good Wi-Fi security, WPA3 is probably what you want to be using. So maybe you want to give it a try and see what breaks on your network. So all this talk about the dangers of shared passphrases brings us to the last method of authentication in Wi-Fi, WPA-Enterprise. So there's a WPA2 and a WPA3 version, but fundamentally the only difference is what features are required versus optional. Specifically, WPA3 requires the use of protected management frames, which didn't exist when WPA2 was developed and were later marked optional. However, you can still enable those in WPA2 anyway. So essentially, in WPA-Enterprise, the access point creates a tunnel to an authentication server, the Radius server. And this allows the client to directly exchange 802.1x authentication frames between itself and the Radius server. And if it can prove to the Radius server its identity, then the Radius server will tell the access point to grant it access. This also generates the session keys. Now there's a number of protocol options here, but by far the two most popular are PEEP and TLS. And despite its name, PEEP also uses TLS. So in PEEP, the client and the Radius server set up a TLS session. The server provides its certificate. So the client could validate that certificate and show that the network is authentic. So no one can spoof our network because they don't have the private key matching the certificate. The client, for its part, exchanges its username and password over the TLS tunnel, essentially in the clear. So if an attacker were to stand up our network and were to pass that certificate check, they would have direct access to the username and password. This is important because in WPA2 Enterprise, the client was not required to validate that the certificate was valid. So some implementations will automatically accept the first certificate they connect to and cache that for the future. Some will go through the chain of trust properly like they should, and some won't care at all. So this is a bit of a deficiency in WPA2 versus WPA3 that the clients don't always check the certificate. And it's not so much that the encryption is broken or anything, it's just that the standard wasn't clear on what the client should do. Once the Radius server has the username and password, it can go to a database like Microsoft Active Directory or LDAP or just a file, compare the username and password, and tell the access point that it's good or bad. So network-wise, this is a pretty big improvement over what we had before. Because every user has their own username and password, we can enable and disable these usernames and passwords at will. We can link them to a directory like Microsoft Active Directory or LDAP that we might use for other things. Pretty great. The downside is, it's still a password the user still has to remember, and they could still give it to someone else if they wanted to. So for that reason, I'm not quite giving it S tier. But for WPA3 PEEP, I'm going to give it A tier, because it's pretty good. Now for WPA2, because of that thing about validating certificates, I'm going to put it down in C tier. And finally, the S tier champion, EAP-TLS. So with this method, the client and the Radius server, they both set up a TLS session. They both have a private key and a certificate. They validate the chain of trust of each other's certificates, and all is good. So with this method, the computer stores the private key and the certificate of the client. In some cases, it's possible to store it in a trusted platform module or hardware security module. So modern Apple devices, for example, are all capable of storing Wi-Fi keys in hardware, so they cannot be exported and cannot be shared. Another fringe benefit of WPA3 Enterprise is that it allows us 192-bit security instead of only 128-bit. Not that that's low with AES, but more is better, right? Now there are two other technologies that are adjacent to wireless security that I thought were important to mention here. The first one of those is hidden networks. You've probably all seen the checkbox in your Wi-Fi access point, hide SSID. Then it doesn't show up when you look for it. Does that provide any security? Absolutely not. So in a normal Wi-Fi network, the access point periodically broadcasts beacon frames. The beacon frames have a ton of information about the network, what channel it's on, what type of security it uses, other information like that, as well as the BSSID, which is the MAC address of the access point, and the SSID, which is the name of the Wi-Fi network. All that checkbox does is it disables the SSID. Everything else is still transmitted regularly in the beacon frames. So now you're like, well, I guess people have to guess the name of the network, except they don't. When a client wants to connect to a network, it sends a probe request, which includes the SSID of the network. So if your attacker sits there and listens and is like, wow, there's a bunch of traffic going on, all they have to do is wait for a client to authenticate, and the client will say what the name of the network is. If you're not using protected management frames, they can also send a deauth. That'll kick the client off the network. The client will rejoin the network. Boom, now you know what the SSID is. And it actually gets even worse than that. So normally, a client can scan and say, I'm looking for an access point, Bill Y, the science fi. I don't see him, so I won't do any probe requests. I can't connect to that network. But if you use a hidden network that you type in manually, now everywhere your client goes, all over the world, they're going to be sending out probe requests. Does anyone know Bill Y? Does anyone know Bill Y? Is he around here? Because they can't scan and see if he's there because it's a hidden network. So now instead of hiding your SSID, now you've got your computer going all over the world, broadcasting it in the air to everyone, trying to probe for it. So don't use hidden networks. They're a bad idea. And the last one is using multiple networks for different security domains. This is usually a good idea to have multiple SSIDs, but it's very easy to go too far. It's very common for networks to have a network that uses WPA-Enterprise, whether that's 2 or 3, and a separate network that does not, for devices that don't support WPA-Enterprise. This is probably what you're going to end up in your own network doing. That only results in having 2 networks. If you throw in a guest network in there, that's 3. Most access points will let you have a lot of networks. Some can do, say, 8 per band. And if you wanted to do 8 per band, you would have one access point broadcasting 8 sets of beacon frames. And the more SSIDs you do, the more beacon frames this AP has to generate, because it has to generate separate beacon frames for each network. It does them like 10 times per second. So if you've got 8 different SSIDs, you've got 8 beacon frames, 80 beacon frames per second. All of them have to be transmitted on the basic rate, and if you still support 802.11b and G, that's 1.5 megabits per second. So the frames take a lot of time in the real world, even though they're not very long in bytes, because they're transmitted at such a slow rate. So you end up wasting a ton of valuable airtime with these beacon frames just so you can have 8 SSIDs. So tangential to that as well, if you can disable 802.11b and G and use higher bandwidth basic rates, like 6 megabits or more, then you will not be wasting so much airtime on your beacon frames. Also, multicast and broadcast, if they're not translated to unicast, also take the basic rate, which can possibly be very slow. So is using multiple SSIDs for different security domains a good idea? Possibly. If you can do it through Radius instead, so that would be the TLS certificate, look up in the Radius server, database of what VLAN they belong on, great. Same with PEEP, you have authentication, what VLAN do they belong on, great. And this is a case where private pre-shared keys are really useful. It's for segregating by VLANs, so you don't need to have multiple SSIDs. As a security measure, it's not necessarily more secure than regular WPA2 or WPA3 encryption-wise, but for network segregation, it can be a big benefit in security. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tour of the different methods of Wi-Fi security, in-depth review of WPA2 cracking, ethically of course, and all of the ins and outs of why your password is so important for WPA2. So hopefully after this video you guys can make some considerations of your password choices. If you want to do any of the more advanced features such as private pre-shared keys, I have a video on that up here. I also have a video on enterprise authentication coming out shortly, so that's going to be up here. I guess if it's already out, it'll already be up here. That's WPA3 EAP-TLS. That's a pretty cool method as well. This video doesn't have any sponsors, so it's just helped with donations from people like you. If you want to give me a tip, there's a link down below for Ko-fi. You can donate however much you want. I always appreciate it. If you're interested in chatting with me about Wi-Fi or network security in general, anything like that, link down in the description to my Discord server. And as always, I'll see you guys on the next adventure.